Good morning. I'm Asha Nayaswami, and we're talking about the masters of our path. So let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to understand our true relationship to God and Guru. Help us to bring that understanding so deep within our hearts, our minds, and our souls that we act spontaneously, sincerely, and naturally, always in accordance with that reality. Transform us from ordinary human beings to perfect instruments of your divine love. Om. Peace. Amen. Before I go on with what I was going to talk about of Master, although this may end up actually being a little bit more about him than I was thinking, in the context of the last couple of talks, I believe, I've talked about the time when I realized that I was a white woman. And in the context of what's been going on in our country, I just thought I would pause for a minute and talk about what the thoughts that were generated in my mind. And I want to acknowledge a certain realizations that I recognize. I grew up Jewish, and I lived until I was 15 in El Paso, Texas. El Paso is right at where Texas meets New Mexico. So you have a picture of Texas, but it's really the eastern side of Texas. Where I grew up, we didn't have that exaggerated Texas accent. And we weren't really quite the South, whereas if you go farther into Texas, you're really moving into the South. We were more like the West. But nonetheless, it was what it was. My father actually, but I was a Jewish family there. The Jews were a minority. There was a couple of synagogues, and there was a community that my parents were part of. In fact, we lived in one part of the city until I was 9, but then my parents moved to a different part so that we would be part of a Jewish community, because not that we were religious, but it was just I think the need to be with kindred spirits, and that's the people they felt comfortable with. So I was always aware of minority issues, and I was aware of course, because I was born in 1947. I had no relatives in Europe, so there was nothing about what happened that touched me personally. Our families our families were small to begin with, and we had emigrated in my grandparents' generation. Um, but it was always there that there was this reality. I never personally experienced anti-Semitism in my entire life. I don't, and to use that, that phrase, I don't look Jewish. So as a result, it didn't come up. I didn't have a particularly Jewish sounding name. Our family name was Projector, of all things, which just didn't sound like anything. Nobody knew where that name came from. The family lore was that when the family came across on Ellis Island, they were from, let's see, that they would have been from Russia. And there was a comparable Russian word that meant somebody who accomplishes things. And so conceivably that was the name, and some humorous immigration just wrote down Projector, and that was it. There's almost none of us. And in El Paso was still enough south that there were certain segregations in place, and my father took it upon himself to act in favor of integration. And he, in his quiet way, he integrated the YMCA and the libraries and a few things like that, mostly just on his own, by just making it happen. And I remember talking to him about it, and him saying that because we were in El Paso instead of Dallas, it wasn't dangerous. I mean, it was just like we were just safe enough. And I remember at the time talking to him and thinking about what would he have done if it had been dangerous? Would he still have, had the courage to go forward? And my father, in his way, just he had a method, which is that he would take his black friends, and they would just go and use facilities. They would go to the library on a regular basis for a month or something, or to the Y, and then he would present it as a fait accompli. So when people would say, the world won't stand for it and so on like this, he was very clever and he was very dedicated. There was absolutely no reason in the world why he needed to have done that. And there was a book called The Nature of Prejudice, which it was required reading in our family, and we all needed to understand. And it was essentially, it was a well-known book at the time, but I can't remember. But the essence of the story was anybody who is a bigot is expressing their own personal inadequacies, and it's always a projection of your need to be more powerful over others. But my father thought it was extremely important growing up that we understood, that we really understood how human nature works. I took all of that for granted. I thought everybody, was everybody's childhood reading was your father sitting reading The Nature of Prejudice to you and Parkinson's Law about how corporations work. Not that it was extreme, but it was just because we were Jewish. And being Jewish, a lot of your religion is right behavior, ethical, the mitzvah. You do the right thing. That's you do the right thing by man and by God, and that's who you're supposed to be. Except when I wanted to go and help in Mississippi during that freedom summer, and I was 15, probably, maybe 16. My parents were far too terrified. They wouldn't even consider it. So there was definitely a limit. I thought they would want me to go, but the fear way overcame anything. So there was a limit. Um, but through all of that, this is what's interesting to me, and this I'm acknowledging this for I want to pick this issue up from a string that I can feel positive about and also extremely supportive about. Still, fast forwarding to 1986, it probably would have been. By then, I'm part of Ananda, and this is the first or second trip. It might have been the first trip that I took to India, and there's a wonderful man. His name is Sanjay Arora, and he was our travel escort. He eventually opened his own travel company. He's still a good friend. So all these years later, we met him when he was in his early 20s, just starting his career. We were his client for all those years. Our tour group. We followed him as he changed, and he was the first Indian person that became a good friend of mine. And in the context of one of our early conversations, he was referring to one of his Indian friends who had married a white woman. And this was sort of the stories that I mentioned recently. And he just said that as if that was so obvious that he'd married a white woman. And he also talked about the office that he was in where the boss was a white man. Actually, both things happened, but the white woman was the one that struck me the most. And I didn't think of Sanjay as being in any way a different race or a different kind of person than me. He looked Indian, which meant that, if I put my arm up against his, our skins were completely different color. As it happened, he was a fairly westernized Indian, but he was just a person. And I would never have thought of him in terms of his color. And I don't think technically even, in fact, technically, we're both Caucasians. This is something that Master, and I'm going to tell a little bit about Master and race here too. Master, he was not a Negro. He was dark. He had features that you might have thought of as related to Africans, but he was Caucasian, just dark skin. So it certainly race never entered my mind talking about Sanjay. Not that race entered my mind anyway, except that I'm incredibly observant. So I can't say that I wouldn't know what race someone was, but it would just be like the dress they were wearing or something like that. But when he called me a white woman, I had to stop and really I think about that. It amused me to be called a white woman, but also and this is what I was thinking about yesterday, which is why I'm here. If I had been a black woman in America, I would have known what my race was because I would have had to know what my race was. It would have just been an important part of who I was because it would have been presented to me on a regular basis, or I would have had to take action based on it. In a completely other satsang that I gave in one of these mornings, so I'm going to repeat it a little bit. As it happened, on the night that the O.J. Simpson verdict came down and the man was acquitted, he was a very famous football player, a dark-skinned African American, and he was accused of murdering his wife or ex-wife. I know nothing. It seemed probable that he was guilty from various things that happened, but he was acquitted. And he was acquitted on the basis of the fact that too much of the evidence had gone through the Los Angeles Police Department, and there was a belief that the Los Angeles Police Department at that time, and I'm not going to say anything more, would corrupt evidence in order to convict a black defendant. And to my mind, it was just like a completely new idea. Not that I'd never thought of police corruption, but that it just would play such a big part. As it happened, 3 African Americans who were part of Ananda happened to be staying in my house the night the verdict came down. So Naidruva, Diana, and Ram, some of you who know Ananda, they were all in the house at the time. And Keshava, who's actually a Canadian, he's probably one of the whitest guys I know, just talking about the pigment of his skin. Keshava and I, 5 of us, we went out to dinner that very night. The whole restaurant is talking about this verdict, and there aren't very many African Americans in Palo Alto where I live. So there weren't. I don't know if there were any other African Americans in the restaurant, but there was no other table where there were three sitting together. Diana and Ram both grew up in Los Angeles, and Naidruva's an attorney, and she's worked with legal issues for her whole life. She was the first Black woman to graduate from Harvard Law School. She integrated a high school. Their family integrated a neighborhood, so she worked with Martin Luther King. She was knowledgeable. The point of view that the 3 of them had, and of course the police would change things in order to convict a Black man. And then they just went on to tell me stories about growing up in Los Angeles, Diana and Ram, and just like whenever there was a policeman on the street, you tried to get off the street. And you tried to do it casually in such a way that it didn't look like you were trying to get off the street. Ram is a great big football player man. Later, I heard stories from Naidruva's son, who went to college in UCLA and is 6'5", handsome, strong, dark-skinned man. And he the same thing about how you dealt with police if you were Black. And Diana too, even as a woman, she was conscious. I am Black, therefore certain things must happen. And so just as I was raised to know certain things, they were raised to know their race. And that was the piece of it that was so interesting to me. Interesting in the sense of we can live next door to each other and we cannot know what people's realities are. Now, of course, I have lived through it a lot being Jewish. I recently had a conversation. I had 2 about this that were really funny to me. My friend Durga, who is East Coast, has lived on the East Coast, and her family goes back multiple generations in America. I don't think they go quite to the Mayflower, but that's sort of like established American families. And she was talking to me about the dispute in the family as to who was going to inherit grandmother's punch bowl. And first of all, in my own life, like, who wants grandmother's punch bowl? I don't want her punch bowl. It's like, I don't care if there's 12 matching cups. It's just like, I don't want it. But the actual conversation, which was so strange to me, was, you still have your grandmother's punch bowl? Didn't they come and arrest you and drive you out of the country or put you in the prison camps? And didn't you lose everything? Don't you lose everything every generation? How can you still have a possession, a fragile possession like a punch bowl after 4 generations? And it was, she's looking at me like, well, why wouldn't we have it? I have my furniture, I have my this and my that. And I think, how could you possibly hold on to things like that? They will always expel you from the country or put you in prison. And there was absolutely no prejudice on her part. It was just complete unawareness of this parallel track that was always part of my life. It was a what was the other piece of that I wanted to say? Oh, I remember looking at her and I realized that she was a WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That's sort of like, I had a really good friend who was a WASP. And of course, I've been at Ananda for decades. But all of these different threads, you just don't necessarily think about how they go together. And then I'll take this even one further, which only resolved itself like last year, or it was only pointed out to me last year. Now, this is partly because I am sure I have been a revolutionary in many lifetimes. This isn't just being Jewish, but being Jewish really plays into it. I've always assumed eventually I would be in prison and be tortured. And it has literally just been part of my expectation. And I fear it. I fear it tremendously. And that's part of the reason why I think about it. When in any context where that comes up, I always mentally try to prepare myself for when that happens. And I was in India. I was talking to Daya and Keshava. Keshava was with us in the restaurant that night. Um, and I just said something like, of course, the fear of going to prison and being tortured is always there for us, including them in it. And they looked at me and they said, they both said, never, not once have they ever considered it. You've never considered it? I think about it every day. Now, that would be comparable to being a Black person, always thinking, I get stopped because my license plate is smudged. Will I live through the encounter? You have that in your mind that these things are possible. And being Jewish, you have in your mind that no matter how integrated, especially, if you were born in 1947, no matter how integrated you appear to be as part of the culture, you never know because it could just come away from you. Now, these are heart-rending realities, and it is much to the credit of our country that we're now trying to say these things to each other because we really don't know. We really don't know what other people's experience is. And race is a very good entry point into this conversation, but it's the conversation that we really need to have. And the conversation is we need to really know who we are. We really need to know what other people's experience is so that we don't foolishly mistreat each other or have expectations of each other that are not based on anything real. No, we need to have this communion with each other. But that communion is not sufficient if it's just sociological. Okay, you're Black. I have to think about what it is to be Black. I'm Jewish. We have to think about what it is to be Jewish. All these different things. But the only thing that'll really stop this is we are children of God. We are all made from Satchidananda, traveling through this world in whatever costume is the costume that will help us to grow. We are all seeking the same divine bliss, the same desire to escape suffering, and the same desire to have happiness. And to be unconscious is not the same as to be bigoted. To be unconscious is basically, that's what we are, friends. I mean, every mistake I've made in my life is because I didn't know. But that doesn't mean that if I had known, I would have been evil. It just means that I wasn't aware. Everything about personal growth is increasing awareness. Oh, I see. Because of how you grew up, because of the body you wear, this is what you're experiencing. The master experienced racial prejudice because he was dark-skinned. And he went to what, I'm going to try to get these, I'm going to give you stories that may not be exactly right, but I think it was Washington, D.C. They wouldn't let him come in the front door of the hotel. He had to come in the back door of the hotel. They wouldn't let him talk to mixed audiences. There's this wonderful picture of Master started a African American self-realization group, I believe in Washington, D.C., because they wouldn't let him talk to the white people and the Black people together. So he took all the Black people away and talked to them completely separately. Of course, for him, he wasn't even white. He was Caucasian, but he wasn't white. But there he was, and it's just like we're all children of God, and and part of his message is precisely and exactly the answer to the mess of everybody going after everyone else. We, when we don't have inner peace, we project our need for worth against other people. This is what my father trained me in from the cradle. And he was also training me to not hate bigots and not hate people who are prejudiced. He wanted me to understand them because he knew immediately, if you have understanding, you have compassion. So all my life, even when I've seen people who are quite evil in their bigotry, which I have met it. I met it when we were in litigation because I met these fanatical bigots who were out to destroy Ananda. And I understood them because of my father's training. It wasn't race, it was religious bigotry. And it was petty people trying to have power over us. Talking about the attorneys. Just petty, unhappy, twisted up people inside who were looking for somebody to hurt because they thought that would give them power. And you cannot cooperate with that. You have to, you have to build a concrete wall of absolute no in front of that. But the poor souls who are perpetrating it are pathetic. And they might even be powerful, but they're pathetic. And we don't have to hate them. We don't have to judge them. We have to stop them. But we have to participate. We have to make change on the level that change will really happen, which is we are all children of God. And this is a huge message. And I mean, today I was going to talk about Master, and I am talking about the many things that he brought to this country and ultimately to this world. And one of them is simply that. And even in Autobiography of a Yogi, it describes that Master's the very purpose of Master's message. And he talks about race and religious bigotry. This race hatred, religious bigotry, this is the issue. And so, what is happening now to try to disperse and dissolve and raise awareness is exactly what Babaji and Jesus were talking about in the Himalayas to send Yogananda here. So how people choose to participate in this has to be a matter of individual calling, but that we must and are participating is part of our discipleship. I have participated since a very young age after, a brief period of what looks more like political activism. I've dedicated myself to changing consciousness because as long as people are not peaceful in their hearts, they will find some way to project that lack of peace and try to get power over others, whatever form it may take, economic, racial, religious. So we must go to the root cause, and the root cause is our lack of relationship with God. Everything that's going wrong in the world right now is because we have separated ourselves from God. I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about an inner awareness that we're all part of the same greater reality. If we are all part of the same greater reality, then everything else will follow. If I am alone in this world and responsible for myself, only for myself, there will be a cascading series of appalling evils that will result from that, because there will be a desperate effort on the part of that isolated individual to make themselves powerful in some way by controlling their environment. At least I'm bigger than you. But if we know ourselves, and this is where, again, where Jesus and Master said, Kriya Yoga. And it's not like everybody has to become a disciple of Master. Kriya Yoga is the active inner experience of my relationship to God. And Kriya Yoga is the answer. Kriya Yoga can be practiced equally by everyone because it doesn't even happen in your physical body. It happens transcending your physical body. So the body you're wearing is completely incidental. There's one last story, and Swami said he didn't tell it very often, but it's an interesting story about Master. He was somewhere in the South, and he was in a restaurant, and there was a white man who was waiting on him. He was probably with a mixed race group, and he refused. And the man said, We won't serve you because we don't serve Negroes." And probably didn't use such a polite word, but the master said, "I'm not a Negro. Indians are Caucasian." And he still wouldn't serve him, but the way Swami put it is master ordered him to bring a dish. And so master must have used enough force that the man brought him a plate of food. When the plate of food was put in front of master, master threw it in the face of the waiter. Isn't that something? Swami said he didn't tell that story very often because it's not the picture that you hear. But I think it's a good picture to know, because even those of us who are not what I would call politically active in the traditional sense, our gurus are warriors. And whenever evil predominates and virtue declines, I, the infinite spirit, that's what Krishna says, take visible form in order to eliminate darkness and to give light, bring light back into the ascendancy. So that was a very, very, very unusual situation for Master, and he had the intuition to know that it was the right thing to do. But we can't be cowards. But also we can't get swept up in ideas that are not sound. I did not know I was a white woman until Sanjay told me. But I've never in my life behaved in such a way as to take advantage of that, certainly not with conscious will. Inadvertently, by the nature of society, perhaps, what can I say? But we need to work together. We need to work together with God. And our masters have incarnated precisely to resolve the dilemmas that are coming to the surface. And so we also need to feel that by cooperating with our masters, I mean, it is very important. It's very interesting. I referred to that paragraph in autobiography over and over and over again. I think it's on page 291, if I'm not mistaken. It's that we're on a mission, and it's very gratifying, sort of, to see on different levels an awareness of that mission rising to the surface. We must put our lives, our society, our world in harmony with higher truth. And we haven't been acting strongly and fast enough. So Divine Mother has just basically picked up the planet and has begun to shake it. And we need to find our alignment, not with superficial trends and passing things, but with the deepest issues that God, Guru, and Divine Mother are really trying to get us to see. I am a child of God. I am a part of all that is. This is what we say in our Festival of Light every week. You are a part of all that is. And that's what we have to meditate on. And that's what we have to integrate so deeply into our hearts that no other response is possible except, greetings to my brothers and sisters in God. God bless you.